I want to say hello to everybody. My name is Sadie Waddington, and I'm the Communications and Outreach Director for Coastal Quest. I'll be one of the facilitators for today's webinar, along with my colleague, Lilia Lamkin, who will be, we are both located in California, Oakland, California, and Lilia will be providing chat and technical support in case you need any help. Feel free to reach out, and we can get you set up if you're having any access issues. I want to welcome you this morning to our webinar on biodiversity credits, opportunities for coastal conservation and restoration. This webinar is part of the Coastal Quest movement to share, learn, and connect virtually to build the pipeline and multi-benefit coastal solutions for 30 by 30 efforts on the ground. So we aim to provide practitioners space to explore and learn from experts and hear case studies that demonstrate nature-based solutions for building coastal resilience that are community-driven and provide multi-benefits. So today we're exploring biodiversity credits. But before we begin, we'd like to share a couple announcements. So we'll be sharing in our chat a couple links to our Nature-Based Solutions 30 by 30 webpage, where you can see previous recordings, and you'll be able to access more information about future webinars, as well as resources such as our coastal funding database. Okay. So a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, as I shared. Coastal Quest may use the video footage for footage recorded during the webinar for educational and promotional purposes. The recording of the webinar will be available for viewing on our Coastal Quest website. And second, closed captioning of the webinar is available, and if we have it in multiple languages. So to access the closed captioning, you can click the closed caption and translation button at the bottom of the Zoom application and select the language of your choice. We do have our chat open, but we encourage all attendees to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is also open. At the bottom of the Zoom application. This will allow speakers to answer some of the questions during other presentations and be able to interact with you as well. So our objectives today for our webinar, this series is to learn about different approaches to nature-based solutions and to promote coastal projects that are multi-benefit, community-driven, and equitable. Okay. And our topic for today, we have an amazing group of speakers who'll be sharing information about changes to implementing biodiversity credits and solutions, some of the barriers that we're working to overcome, ways to establish credibility and trust with consumers, and then how to scale some of these biodiversity credit programs to really make them impactful. So taking them from that sort of theoretical side into the field. We'll also be looking at accessing funds generated by biodiversity credits and case studies to share the success. So our agenda today, we'll be giving a quick overview of Coastal Quest and our nature-based solutions for a Resilient Coast program. We'll then be having two speakers followed by a very brief Q&A session. And then we'll move into our second two speakers, followed by a longer Q&A session and more of a space for open discussion. And then we'll have a quick poll before we share. We'd like to share some of our resources for coastal funding. That's our coastal funding database, next steps, and staying in touch. So I'd like to kick us off by sharing a little bit about Coastal Quest, our organization who's hosting our webinar today. So our mission as Coastal Quest is to accelerate solutions to build resilient coastal communities. And we focus on people, nature, and climate as part of what we consider to be building those solutions in those communities. Our future goals for the coast. So we have two main areas where we focus in on our work, protecting and enhancing coastal ecosystems. So looking at that multi-benefit solution for healthy and and resilient coasts. And we're really looking at the through a nature-based approach. You can see some of the different areas that marine, coastal, intertidal, and wetland watershed habitats are all areas that we're focusing in on, as well as species and areas of blue carbon significance. And then the other piece of our overarching goal is to increase coastal resilience for vulnerable communities and economies. So we're really looking at that, turning to our frontline vulnerable communities to really give us to share with us and partner with us to build bottom-up multi-benefit solutions. And we're looking to build that human and financial capacity, looking with partnerships between public and private. And we're also looking to incorporate our local governments and breaking through some of these funding inequities. So on to today's webinar. Let's get started here. We're going to be kicking off our topic with for our first two speakers. So let me introduce these two individuals to you. We have Josh Brand, who's the technical coordinator for biodiversity for the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, and then Juan Carlos, and I've been practicing his last name, so here we go, Viaja Señor Derbez, and he is the assistant professor over at the University of Miami. So welcome to you both. First, I will introduce Josh with a short bio, and then Josh will be sharing his screen and giving a presentation, followed by I'll introduce Juan Carlos after Josh, and then we'll go into our Q&A. Right. So Josh serves as the technical coordinator for the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, BCA, where he spearheads the BCA's efforts to develop biodiversity credit markets based on principles of equity, quality, and integrity. With over 2 decades of experience in biodiversity conservation and conservation finance, Josh has played a pivotal role in designing and implementing innovative approaches to align environmental and economic goals. Josh, please go ahead and share your screen and unmute yourself for your presentation.
Right. Thank you, Sadie. I will do my best to coordinate all those clicks here in, let's see here. Right. Sorry, I'm going to have to click onto that so I can then actually see the click to make it full screen.
No problem. And we
All
can
right.
spotlight Josh. Go ahead, Josh. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Sadie and Coastal Quest for organizing this great event. Very much appreciate the invitation to participate. And over the past year or more, we've seen definitely high interest in biodiversity credits, and also particularly in the marine space and marine biodiversity credits. So it's fantastic to see that enthusiasm here today and the level of participation and engagement. So just briefly, a little bit about the Biodiversity Credit Alliance for anybody that's not familiar with the BCA. BCA is a UN-backed organization or coalition of like-minded organizations that are working together to help develop the biodiversity credit market in line with principles of equality, integrity, and equity, as Sadie mentioned. We do have a main decision-making body is the BCA Task Force, which is a group of 20 organizations that provide the leadership for the BCA. Our BCA Forum is our knowledge network and community of practice, which has more than 500 organizations participating. And I would encourage any of you that are not already part of the BCA Forum you're welcome to join that group. You can do so on our website, where you can also find a lot more information about the BCA. So, and then we have also the BCA, formerly known as the Communities Advisory Panel, but the International Eco Guardians, which is a consultative body for community level stakeholders. And then the BCA Secretariat is provides the support and coordination for the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. So just to sort of start at the beginning here, for any of you that may not be familiar, what actually is a biodiversity credit? A biodiversity credit is a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would have otherwise occurred. And that's the definition that was published in the BCA issue paper, a definition of a biodiversity credit, which you can find on our website. That definition has been embraced and widely accepted, I would say, in the market. And so that is a generally well accepted definition of a biodiversity credit. And there's a number of key terms in there that you can find that are further elaborated and defined in that issue paper that you can find on our website. So for anybody that is interested in digging into that a little bit more. So then key issues for marine biodiversity credits. One of the significant things that the BCA has done over the past year, working with the partners of the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, IAPB, and the World Economic Forum, as well as a number of other participating organizations and partners. One of the key things we've done is to develop and publish a set of high-level principles to guide the development of the biodiversity credit market. We presented those high-level principles at COP16 in Colombia last October to quite positive reception. And however, as we were developing those principles, it was clear that there are a number of principles that need further consideration in the context of marine and coastal biodiversity. So for example, I'm not going to go into all these principles now. Again, that information is available, that publication and information is available on our website. It's currently as a discussion paper, but is about to be published in its final form in the coming weeks. So I'm not going to go into these in detail, but one of the things that, as I mentioned, one of the key issues were that the implementation of these principles in the marine and coastal realm, it may be a little bit different than in the terrestrial realm. So there's certain things we need to think about and consider, particularly, for example, on these 9 or 11 principles, I think, on the right-hand side there that we've identified as having particular considerations for marine and coastal ecosystems. Just for example, on legal and customary rights, we have, for example, just the most obvious example would be in the high seas where there's not national jurisdiction. So how would biodiversity credit project be implemented in that context? So how to address some of these considerations and issues, we have put together a marine biodiversity credits working group, again, in collaboration with partners such as the Global Fund for Coral Reefs and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, Climate Impact Partners, and a number of other organizations, looking at how to provide guidance and recommendations on implementation of high-level principles in the marine and coastal context for biodiversity credit projects. So then circling back to the bigger picture of the biodiversity credit market as a whole, the supply side of the market is developing rapidly. That's the good news. I think there's more than 50 different crediting methodologies and schemes that have popped up in the past couple of years, and that number continues to grow. The total amount of volume of the market, nobody knows exactly for sure, and it's continuing to further develop as new transactions happen. But our current estimates are that the market is likely still under, let's say, a $10 million mark. It may be creeping up into that range or slightly above that range, but we're talking at the moment around about millions of dollars here, not tens of millions of dollars. So there is consistent but slow linear growth in demand. That's the big question. Like, what is demand? How's demand going to develop, and what is that going to look like? And basically, when we think about the biodiversity credit market in relation to the path and the trajectory that the carbon market has taken, we're sort of where the carbon market was 20 or 25 years ago, and the carbon market kind of bumped along at a slow, consistent but slow rate of growth over 10 or 15 years before sort of reaching a little bit more exponential growth in the last 5 years or so. And again, that's kind of been up and down a little bit in the last year or two. So we will touch on some of these issues a little bit more in the question and answers portion. I'm sure people have some questions about that. So what are some of the key challenges and barriers to further development of the market? One is a lack of an adequate market governance structure. So there's no currently independent, for example, no independent oversight body or review mechanism or any sort of, let's say, standardized approach to how the market functions. The high-level principles that we've developed provide an initial foundation for the further development of that, but there's a lot of work to be done to develop that. Other aspects such as credit valuation frameworks and pricing, in this stage of the market, there are a lot of questions around pricing without getting into too many details around that, but to develop better understanding of pricing, we need more transactions in the market. So and also in claims guidance, if somebody's interested in purchasing a biodiversity credit, what can they say about that? What does that convey in terms of claims that they might be able to make around that? And then, just the financial models of developing these types of market mechanisms, definitely still very much in development, and different project developers are looking at different approaches there. So then there's, definitely still open questions and lack of experience around questions and issues such as additionality, permanence, benefit sharing, and governance and equity models involving Indigenous and local communities. So BCA is working on many of these issues, but in partnership with a lot of other organizations. But we do have limited resources, and definitely always welcome support and contributions from all interested parties. So happy to have further engagement and partnership with anybody that may be interested in reaching out. So additional opportunities for marine biodiversity credits going forward. There's multiple potential sources of demand. It's not just the private sector that may be interested in purchasing biodiversity credits. You also have government actors that can use biodiversity credits as a way to implement government policies. The philanthropy sector may be a good initial entry point for a lot of biodiversity credit schemes. The question around global versus local markets. Biodiversity is local, so the market may actually be much more local as well, and not have a sort of global market, single unified market on biodiversity credits, but maybe a much more local market. A key thing is identifying demand partners in advance, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the question and answer section as well. But then also just the opportunity to link with the carbon market. We try to make a lot of distinctions between carbon and biodiversity and how they're very different. But when it comes to implementing projects on the ground, there's a lot of opportunity for co-benefits and the potential for single transactions there. So how to engage? You can join the BCA forum, as I mentioned. Check out our website. Follow us on LinkedIn. Through the BCA forum, you get information from the BCA newsletter and access and information about BCA webinars and other events. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. And thanks again, Sadie, for the invitation. And hopefully I stuck close to my time there, but happy to get into the help with the question and answer session as well. So thank you very much, everybody.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Josh. And if you'd like to put any of these contact pieces into the chat, I'm sure that'll be a great way for our audience to pick up on some of the tools to continue to stay in touch. That's great. Thank you. All right, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Juan Carlos, who holds a Bachelor's of Science in Oceanography from UABC in Mexico, where he's from, and a Master's and PhD in Environmental Science and Management from UC Santa Barbara here in California. But he is not located here. He's over on the other side of the country. Juan Carlos is at the University of Miami, and his research seeks to estimate costs and benefits of MPAs and understand the resilience and vulnerabilities of coastal communities and ecosystems to environmental shocks, and design and simulate market-based conservation interventions. Wow, that's a mouthful. So over to you, Juan Carlos. If you could please share your screen, and you can go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadie, and hopefully my screen is now shared.
Perfect.
Does that work? Great. All right. Let me just try to time it to make sure I keep myself in check. Thank you, Sadie, for the introduction and for inviting me. And thank you, Josh, for providing a great introduction to a lot of what I'll be talking about. I just deleted some slides quickly to not be redundant. So if my presentation looks a little bit Frankenstein-ish, is because I'm trying to save you some time. The focus of my talk is going to be showing you whether messing around with the business as usual, right, no biodiversity credits, is worth it. Because if going about implementing biodiversity credits results in large savings, then we can justify moving things around. If the savings are relatively small, then maybe we could go forward the way we are. And I think you're going to like the answer. So I'm going to skip through this one that I didn't lead. But the idea here is that I'm going to show you some information about environmental markets and how they can be used to solve different environmental challenges. Then I'm going to give you some super quick overviews of features that we need to have in environmental markets for them to function as markets, other than sort of like just transactions going back and forth. And then I'll give you an example of how conservation credits or biodiversity credits could be used to reduce the cost of attaining the 30% protection targets by 2030, as stated in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So environmental markets have been proven to reduce fisheries collapse, for example, through individual transferable quotas, improve the quality and availability of water, especially in California. There's a lot of water markets in California that have shown that, and improve air quality. And this includes emissions trading schemes, again, like the ones in California, but also the ones in the European Union. And the idea is that you set or limit the amount of pollution or water extraction that you're going to have from the system, and allow users that participate in the system to find what's the most optimal way to do so, or to meet those requirements by allowing trade. The main argument, or the main reason why we like this idea, is because they can be very efficient, right? Actors by themselves can decide what's the best way to do so without having direct government intervention or institutional intervention. Now, I want to emphasize that markets are not the only way to solving environmental problems. There's just simply one of the ways, and one of the ones that we're advocating for here. But things like self-organization and collective action are also relevant. Mandates, unilateral mandates certainly work. And there may be other types of regulation that can achieve similar goals. The question is whether they achieve them at the most cost-effective way. Like I said, there are 4 important features of a market that you should be sort of skeptical and aware of when someone is trying to sell you something, basically. One of them is a market scope. And by scope, I mean, I'm referring to what is being traded and where is it being traded, right? If I am selling just a biodiversity credit that has no proof of additionality and no proof of positive outcome, then what am I actually selling you, right? It might be a nice PDF embroidered with my logo. Is that a biodiversity credit? And where is the biodiversity in this case being produced or conserved? Then we care about the market gap, the total amount or the limit on what's being traded, right? In the case of 30 by 30, well, the goal or the cap is to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030. So there's a total amount of conservation that we want to produce in the form of marine protected area coverage. And then the allowances and allocations. Who holds rights and obligations to participate in such a market or to participate in trying to attain those targets? And how are these obligations distributed among users? And finally, I think Joshua already pointed out this important point, but compliance. How do we make sure that once a transaction occurs, the conservation that is being produced gets respected or holds in time, basically. So in this case, I'm going to show you an application of an environmental market for marine conservation. We generally know where we would want to protect things in the marine environment. And yet, marine protected area coverage targets are lagging behind what we see on land and where we would presumably want to be if we want to meet 30 by 30. So it's not that we're not taking action because we don't know where to take action. Instead, I think we can all agree on that one of the main reasons why conservation doesn't go into place, at least in the marine environment, is because it's costly to conserve. Politicians face pushback from different economic sectors when you present the idea of excluding economic activities from a large area of ocean. Now, something interesting is that many works before have shown that if nations could cooperate between each other, they could reduce the cost of conservation. Basically, strategizing on where to conserve between two nations is cheaper than each nation going at it alone. The problem is there is no way to incentivize this cooperation, right? We know it's better for all of us, but there's no way we're going to engage in that just on the word. So this is where the idea of a market comes in, because we can use that to induce cooperation. And importantly, we can try to estimate, if we were to do or to implement such a market, how big are the potential cost savings? Again, if the cost savings are small, maybe it's not worth disrupting the business as usual scenario. If the cost savings are large, then that incentivizes basically everyone that's here in this call to keep working towards that and to push for that change. To give you an example of how this would work, let's take the example of the Global Biodiversity Framework that requires nations to basically protect 30% of the exclusive economic zones, right? That's how we are going to meet. The target is to protect 30% of the oceans. The way in which it is allocated is every nation does so by protecting 30%. So imagine you have two countries. One option is that countries can attain that conservation target through uniform conservation mandates. Each country protects 30%. In doing so, country one might include larger costs of doing so than country two. This could be perhaps because country one has more valuable resources or economic activities that are going to be displaced when conservation goes into place relative to country two. This is currently how the Global Biodiversity Framework operates. It doesn't matter if it's more costly for you than it is to me, you have to attain 30% conservation. Now, perhaps an alternative way to do this is one where country one produces less conservation within their waters, but instead they pay country two to conserve a little bit more in their name. The reason why this works is because country two will only be willing to take that money in exchange for that commitment if they're better off, right? If the money that they receive is more than the cost of attaining that conservation. Likewise, country one will only do that if paying country two is cheaper than protecting in their own waters. This is the reason why markets are efficient. If that happens, then the costs to country one are reduced, and the cost to country two are reduced because they are now being paid to conserve. So the question is, can we do this at the whole world, not just in this little two country example? So in our case, the scope are going to be exclusive economic zones of the world. I'm going to limit this experiment or this analysis to areas where countries hold rights, where there is some jurisdiction. And I'm going to measure conservation benefit as a combination of the amount of habitat that is being protected and the quality of the habitat. But as we'll see later on during today, there's many ways in which you could measure this. This is just one measure. And I chose this measure because it's the one that's closest in spirit to what's in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is simply square kilometers. Here I'm at least accounting for better and worse square kilometers. The cap is simple. 30% of coastal and oceanic waters within national jurisdiction. And the allocation is also simple, proportionally distributed across nations based on the extent of their exclusive economic zone. I'm not mentioning much about the compliance part because it's basically the Global Biodiversity Framework could provide us in compliance. All we are doing is, what if you allow nations to trade? What I find when I do that, and I'm happy to go into detail later on how we do that, we find that if you allow for a global market where any nation can interact with any nation, you would reduce the cost of global conservation, or meeting 30 by 30, by about 98%. And importantly, every nation stands to win. Nations that sell conservation are making money when they are producing that additional conservation, and nations that buy conservation are saving money because they're being able to meet their targets at a lower cost. Now, you might say, well, but that's not fair, right? Here you're allowing nations with kelp forests to engage in trade with nations with coral reefs, and we want to make sure that we protect a little bit of each of them, right? Basically 30% of each of them. That's what the spirit of the GBF means. And you would be correct. And then you could also go further and say, well, even within coral reefs, there are differences, right? The coral reefs in the Pacific are very different than the coral reefs in the Caribbean. And even though to the untrained eye, you might just see a fish and an anemone, they are different species, and we presumably care about them equally. They're not interchangeable. Well, there's a way to account for that. The way we can do that is that we divide the world into bubbles, trading bubbles or market bubbles. In the case of this analysis, I can divide the world into 4 slices defined by the hemispheres, or use biogeography to divide the world into the 12 biogeographic realms, into 60 biogeographic provinces, or into 219 ecoregions. And what these bubble policies do, they say you're allowed to trade things within the bubble, not outside the bubble. So if we care about the coral reefs in the Caribbean, you're only allowed to trade within the coral reefs in the Caribbean. So Mexico might engage with Belize to trade coral reef there, but Mexico will not engage with Indonesia to trade coral reefs because they're inherently different. And when we do that, that allows us to have more precise control over the outcome of the market, right? What gets protected. But it limits the potential set of trading partners, so you have a much smaller market. And this essentially reduces how efficient a market can be in allocating conservation. Now, the reduction in efficiency might seem large compared to the 98% I gave you, but even in the super strict case of an ecoregion bubble policy, you're still saving 37% of the cost relative to a business as usual. And if you think about it, the business as usual case where trade is not allowed, it's kind of a bubble policy on the basis of exclusive economic zones, right? Nations within their exclusive economic zone can define where they conserve. The problem is EEZs have little to no ecological significance, whereas ecoregions do. And more importantly, those numbers that I showed you are for the 30% target, but there may be other targets. For example, there's a group of scientists that think that the 30% should be just a milestone and we should strive for 50%. And the takeaway here is that it doesn't matter here on the x-axis what amount you want to conserve. A market will always yield positive market gains relative to business as usual. And of course, the more you want to conserve, like if you want to conserve the entirety of the world, then it doesn't matter how you do it because the entirety of the world is the entirety of the world. So the main point about this is that the gains from allowing trade in conservation obligations are large, between 37 and 98%, depending on which assumptions you like best. And this presumably justify disturbing the status quo and pushing for the idea of having biodiversity credits. Interestingly, the spatial constraints will influence the efficiency, but that's a trade-off that we might want to have between habitat representation and the efficiency and cost savings of the market. But the main takeaway is that a market will always reduce the cost of conservation. Hopefully I didn't go over time. If you want to read in more detail about that, you can scan this QR code that'll take you to the paper where we go into great detail about what I explained and many more things that I wasn't able to cover here.
Thank you so much, JC. That was fantastic and very much on time. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and we can put that QR code up later as well. Or if there's a link that you want to share in the chat directly to that, please feel free. That would be great. So we have time for just a couple questions in between from our first 2 speakers and our second 2 speakers. So the Q&A is actually open and I see it's very active. Thank you so much for sharing questions. So the Q&A is open. We encourage you to add your questions and comments into this space. If we don't get to your question during this break, our speakers are encouraged to answer online, so they can go ahead and hit the type answer, and then I see some of our speakers are already getting active in there and sharing answers themselves. They're welcome to do that. Thank you. And then we'll try and get to some of the Q&A questions that are being shared as well. But we're just going to go in, we're going to kick off a little bit slower with more of a kind of a definition focused question just to kick us off here. So if we could, and all our speakers are welcome to engage in this portion as well. We have a question here. What is the difference between outputs and outcomes in biodiversity conservation, just to get us started here. And what is really helpful is when we have those practical on-the-ground examples that demonstrate some of this. So when we're looking at the difference between outputs and outcomes in biodiversity conservation, what does that look like? What are some examples of that? And Josh, I see you're off mute. If you want to start, feel free, or if there's somebody else who'd like to jump in, go ahead, speakers, unmute yourselves, and you're welcome to share your thoughts.
I'd be happy for any of the other speakers to tackle that one in a succinct way. I think that speaks, a little bit to the bigger picture of biodiversity crediting methodologies and how different methodologies address and capture biodiversity outcomes and changes. So, to generate a credit, you have to have some kind of measurement of an outcome, and but there's also methodologies that look at sort of the outputs or the practice level as well, what goes into that activity and methodology. But happy to have any other speakers tackle that as well.
So I can jump in with my perception of it, and I'll just use an example that might or might not be precise. The way I think about it is, for example, an output would be the number of protected areas that you've created, or the number of hectares that are now protected. But the outcome is, the reduction in risk of extinction that you've achieved for a species that was endangered, or the increase in fish biomass or fish biodiversity within the protected areas. And those are different things. There's people that think that we should focus on outcomes, and I think I agree. The challenge with it is that they're harder to measure than the outputs, and that is why a lot of international agreements use slightly looser terminology, more frequently aligned with outputs rather than outcomes.
Thank you so much. That was helpful, just to sort of do a ground setting there. And then we have another question coming in. How do we ensure that biodiversity credits support positive outcomes for people as well as nature? How do we ensure the rights of local resource users and guardians are respected? And how do we ensure that fair sharing of benefits that may derive from the biodiversity credit market? So that sort of equity amongst the resource and the funding that might be generated through the credit market.
I can jump in real quick. This is Kevin Wilden from Sea Trees, and I'll be presenting how we're doing that in a moment. But that is the challenge of biodiversity credits. How can we ensure that local communities are the ones that are primarily benefiting? That's been one of the failings of the carbon market, is that there were fewer safeguards involved. And if anyone's interested in a certain credit of how they do that, what you should do is read the methodology and the project description documents of a credit to explain how they're actually benefiting their local community in their credit design. And you can decide if you like it or not. If you like it, maybe you buy it. Okay? That's how markets work. Find the best one out there. They should be transparent. I mean, eco markets are meant to be transparent so that people can see what's happening. And that, again, is also one of the challenges we're trying to improve upon with biodiversity credits.
And I'll quickly add that a lot of times the angle of equity is rightfully so levied against markets. But I think it's important to mention that if you're implementing a conservation intervention like a marine protected area where you're going to exclude fishers, for example, whether you sell a biodiversity credit attached to it or not doesn't change the impact that you've already have on the real world. So in another way of putting this, the equity angle is not exclusively applied or anchored to market-based solutions. Even if you go and try to meet 30 by 30 without a market, there is the equity concern. And so the idea with a market is that you can build in those requirements, basically, of equitable distribution of the cost and benefits into how you design the market. Whereas on mandates, you can rarely do that.
Thank you so much. And I see a lot of questions coming into our Q&A, which is fantastic. And I think what we actually are going to we're going to move on to our next two speakers. And as these presentations are going, if our other speakers do want to engage with the Q&A that's in the that has been entered and the different questions there, feel free to go ahead and answer those questions, or you can flag any that you'd like to discuss after the second two speakers have presented. Okay, thank you so much. So what I would like to do is introduce our next two speakers, Dr. Tim Coles and Kevin Walden. So Tim will be speaking first. So I'd like to introduce Tim is the CEO of Replanet, which funds ecosystem restoration and protection using carbon and biodiversity credits in 5 main markets: mangrove restoration, restoration of native forests for payments to small-scale farmers, to reforestation unprofitable areas to reforest unprofitable areas in their farms, increasing biodiversity in new marine reserves, protecting under threat high-value nature reserves, and quantifying biodiversity uplift achieved from investment in supply chains. So Tim, go ahead and share your screen and go ahead with your presentation. Thank you so much. Okay.
Can you now see that in full?
No, go ahead and click one more button. Yep, there you go. And then we can spotlight Tim.
Right. Hello, everybody. That sounded a terribly boring introduction that I just wrote there. I'll have to revise that. What I want to talk about is what is the unit of biodiversity gain? Because whilst we've got 50,
Tim, just before you start, if you want to go full screen at the bottom of your slide deck.
Okay, done it. Okay.
Perfect. There we go. You're off.
Right. So what I'm talking about is what is the unit of biodiversity gain? Because we know what it is in the climate world. It's a ton of carbon dioxide. And whilst we can define a biodiversity credit as any project that produces a biodiversity gain, it doesn't have any units on it, and therefore you can't actually use it for comparison. So, for example, you could have a 1% increase in one butterfly species in 1 square meter, and technically that's a biodiversity credit. So clearly what you need are some units now associated with that, and that's what I set out many years ago now with 60 different organizations to try and solve. And we were really stuck because how on earth are we going to do this? And then we thought about the Consumer Price Index, which is a basket of goods and services that every country costs up every year. And we compare inflation rates between countries. But every country's got a completely different set of baskets of goods and services that they're measuring. And so they should, because that's what they're buying in those countries. So if you can use that approach for high finance, why can't you use it for conservation? Why can't you have a basket of metrics that reflect what you're trying to achieve with your particular habitats? And that's the basis of the whole way in which the Wallacea Trust methodology works. Essentially, you choose 5 metrics, and let's now turn the word metric into taxa. That's a zoological taxa like butterflies, or functional taxa like soil invertebrates, and you choose at least 5 taxa, and you measure them at time 0 and how they change over time. And your measure is an increase in the percentage overall value of those metrics that you're measuring over time. So let's take something like breeding birds, for example. You've now got a list of breeding birds at your site. They're not all the same value. Some are much more important than others because they're rare. So you weight them on a 0 to 5 scale, 0 being an invasive, 5 being the most critically endangered. But you're also interested not just in their relative value, but in their relative abundance, because remember, 70% of the world's biodiversity being lost is not species, it's population levels and biomass. And so you rank each species on a 1 to 5 scale, which then you then multiply the abundance scale by the relative conservation value for each species, add them up, and that gives you a score for birds at the beginning point of your process. And you do it again in 2 or 3 years' time. you should now have an increase, partly because you've got 1 or 2 more species, but probably because you've increased the populations of the species that you already had there in the first place. And that will be a percentage difference from the baseline. But you've also done soil invertebrates or, the whole range of different groups, and they've all changed by different percentages. So you take the median value of that, multiply it by the hectareage, and you get the number of units of gain. That's not credits, it's units of gain that you're going to achieve for that time period. Okay. So that's a very swift run through how that system worked. Just trying to figure out how to move this on. Just a moment. Doesn't seem to be moving. There we go. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can treat a system like that, because you're not defining what your metrics are at the beginning. And you're not defining the methods and so forth. So the key part of this is having an independent academic peer review group. And this is called the Biodiversity Futures Initiative. They were set up by NER, which is a funding body in the UK. It's one out of Cambridge and Nottingham universities and various other universities. And what they do is, if you have a claim for biodiversity, they don't just ask you for some, rough data. They want everything. So if you've done meta barcoding, they want the raw bioinformatic data. If you've done camera trapping or sound analysis, they want all the raw data. They compare that to your data sheets, and if the data sheets then tally, they recalculate each one of them, and they say 1 of 3 things. Firstly, yes, you have got your 40% increase in biodiversity over 1,000 hectares, in other words, 40,000 units of gain, or no, you haven't, you've done it wrong, you've made a mistake, you've got 30% increase. Or worst of all, go away, this is so bad, we can't possibly quantify it. So to avoid that one happening, they have a stage 1 process, which is where you present your project, what metrics you're going to use, so you're not going to cheat on the system, what method you're going to use to quantify each metric, not just for species richness, but for relative abundance as well. And particularly, what's your sampling strategy? How many replicas? How are you stratifying your samples and so forth? And that's an iterative process. Once that's agreed, you've then got, you can't fail. I mean, you might not get the biodiversity increase, but you can't be refused independent verification at the end because you've done it wrong. So this leads to a definition of a unit of biodiversity change, which now has units on it. So it's a 1% gain per hectare in the median value of a basket of metrics that reflect the conservation objectives for the submitted habitats and with permanence and additionality. And that works for Vera, it works for Plan Vivo, it works for the Wallacea Trust. So this is the sort of the highest international standard, as it were. Now, note, we keep using the word credits here. Most of the business at the moment has nothing to do with credits. Credits implies issuing units for marketing. Where the market is at the moment is looking, corporates, for example, with carbon projects looking to say, okay, well, we're getting an increase in biodiversity. We might as well quantify what those units have gained. They're not going to sell the credits, but they're going to use it to improve the value of the carbon. But then you come to your marine sites and you're in real trouble then, because unless you're doing mangroves, which has got a load of carbon, very few of the other habitats in the marine environment don't. So this is an example of a site in Indonesia. Well, thanks, Juan Carlos, for mentioning Indonesia. They have got the best reefs, to be honest with you. So, and you've got a lot of problems here with bomb fishing and cyanide fishing and so forth. So here the idea is to try and close off a section of reef and compensate the fishes and allow that reef to recover. So what metrics would you use for that? I mean, the first thing you've got to look at is, what's your structural metric? Well, the structural metric here is probably going to be rugosity, which is how many nooks and crannies and holes there are in the reef. And then you'd use things like coral cover, species richness, and biomass of herbivore fish, same for piscivore fish, species richness and biomass of commercially exploited invertebrates. Now, if all of those improved over time, you would say that reef is improving. Most people would say those are a reasonable set of metrics to measure. So you measure those at your site. But if you're doing an uplift site, you're trying to repair a reef, what you need to be doing is finding an example reef that has not been damaged at all. That's pretty tough in some parts of Indonesia. If you're doing an avoided loss project, what you're doing is you're comparing your existing reef with what it will become if you don't do something about it. In other words, you go to a site that's been badly damaged and you compare the metrics between those sites. Now, let's say the average difference in those metrics is 400% and your reef area covers 1,000 hectares. That would give you 400,000 units of gain if you could protect that area for 25 years. But nobody's going to wait for 25 years to get the money. What you need to do is to go to get some advanced funding. And then with the advanced funding, you set up the monitoring and the intervention, and then you remeasure it after, say, 3 years. Now, if your site, your reef, is now the same value or higher than it was, then you can get 400,000 divided by 25, multiplied by 3, in other words, 3/25 of the 400,000, times 0.8. And the times 0.8 is important because you have to have a buffer. Just as you do with carbon, 20% of the units of gain are set aside as a buffer. So that will give you 38,400 biodiversity credits issued over that time period. So at $75 a credit, you were talking about just under $1 million for protecting a reef like that. And that is now in the realms of viability for funding projects like reef protection. Now, this last example is an uplift one. This is an island in Scotland that's being rewilded. It's the largest uninhabited island in the UK, heavily overgrazed, up to their eyes in red deer on there, need to be reduced. The idea at the end of it is you're going to get at least 236,000 biodiversity credits and about 60,000 carbon credits. There's not enough carbon credits to fund the whole project, but with the biodiversity credits, it's selling at, say, $10 or $15, then you can fund the entire project. And so when you are in a marine environment, unless you're working in mangroves, and in mangroves, forget biodiversity, just go for carbon, because there's so much money around for funding carbon for mangrove restoration. If you're looking at reefs or protecting fisheries, then I'd seriously look at biodiversity credits using those sorts of units. Incidentally, why don't biodiversity credits sell at the moment? Well, the answer is very simple. If I go to an investor and say, look, give me 20 million for a project, and I'm going to produce your carbon credits at such and such a price, they'll look at their estimate of what the prices will be for carbon, and they'll say yes or no, we can make money on that. If I go to them and say, give me 20 million for a biodiversity project, they're just going to laugh at you, because what's the price of a biodiversity credit in 2030 or 2035? So the only way to get this started is to use philanthropy, and that's the massive advantage of conservation. People like it. Nobody loves a ton of carbon dioxide, but they actually like protecting fisheries and reefs. And people will invest in projects philanthropically because they're good projects. Well, why not quantify the biodiversity gain that they're achieving, issue credits to them so that they can then sell them on the market, and that will allow trading prices to start being discovered. And that's the basis you need before you're going to get large-scale investment in these schemes. Okay, I'll stop at that point.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I'm seeing lots of great questions coming in. I'm also seeing some landing in the chat as well. We're going through the Q&A piece. If you have questions, please go ahead and share there. And we will work on getting to your questions in the next session after our next speaker. So I would like to introduce Kevin Wilden. He is the co-founder of Sea Trees, a 501c3 nonprofit based in California. Sea Trees protects and restores coastal ecosystems around the world and just launched Sea Trees Biodiversity Blocks, which regenerate mangrove forests in Kenya. Kevin has 25 years of experience in carbon markets and solutions to climate change and biodiversity loss. And I just want to point out, this I think will be, Kevin, as you share, you'll have these great case studies that I feel like our Q&A is asking for. People are looking for practical examples of what's going on. So thank you so much, Kevin, and I'll let you go ahead and share screen. I'll stop. And over to you.
Sadie.
Thank you.
So is my screen and audio good?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great. So I'm Kevin Wilden, co-founder of Sea Trees, along with Michael Stewart. We started Sea Trees actually as Sustainable Surf in 2011. And we recently changed our name to Sea Trees at the beginning of this year because that's our primary activation. And why is there we go. Our mission is to regenerate the health of the ocean planet, and our vision is reverse climate change and restore biodiversity. Not small. I'm going to zoom through some of our background. So we work in a lot of different ecosystems. We've currently planted 4 million sea trees, and we define a sea tree as like a mangrove tree planted or a coral fragment or a square foot of kelp forest. It's kind of a fun way to talk about biodiversity units. And we started doing this in 2019, which would be a very early biodiversity credit unit. We currently have 25 project sites around the world in various ecosystems. And the way that we work is we find other local nonprofits who want to restore their local ecosystem. We provide them what they need to run their project, primarily funding, but also science and data support and monitoring, as well as media and storytelling. And here's some examples of ours. Wild Coast, who is a co-sponsor of this, is one of our favorite partners, and many others. And our funding primarily comes from brand partners. So we're pretty unique in that we can find brands who have a CSR commitment, and they're donating to fund our projects. And we provide the media and content and storytelling for their goodwill as well, right? It's a really interesting model. We consider ourselves ecopreneurs, and this is actually a video that Salesforce produced for us a couple of years ago. I mean, it's everyone on this call, I'm going to venture, is an ecopreneur, right? We're trying to blend how do we protect and restore this beautiful planet that we're on in the modern world that's very finance focused, right? That's our goal. That's what we're all trying to figure out. And I think biodiversity credits is a way we can really scale this up. And part of our vision is really like the ocean is what's being left out of the conversation. The ocean is the hero of climate change. Like stories around solving climate change biodiversity, we lack heroes. Like everyone who has kids knows you have a hero to tell a story to make it work well, right? And the ocean contains 90% of all the carbon in the carbon cycle. It can sequester CO2 5 to 10 times faster than other ecosystems on land. 3 billion people depend on the ocean for their livelihood, and there's 2 million species in the ocean, right? So, and this is where I kind of go big picture with everybody. Like, what are the core problems that we're trying to solve? And this is the main one, right? Which is that in our economic Western world, ecology is an externality. It's not valued directly in our financial systems. And the idea of a credit fundamentally tries to put the value of nature internal to our economic system. It's really that simple. In practice, it's hard to implement, but that's the concept, right? That's why credits are so valuable. And I mean, it comes back to the word ecos, which is the ancient Greek word for ecology and economy. Like literally, ecology and economy come from the same word. And like the value ecosystem services is greater than the world's GDP. Like, why wouldn't it be internal? So how do we do that, right? But part of the problem is that now in 2025, we've crossed tipping points in climate. And so there's an exponential change happening to the planet and destruction of basically our ecosystems. So we have to figure out a way to match that rate of change. And markets reward rapid innovation, much more than philanthropy or government controls or requirements. Markets speed up innovation and reward solutions that work best. So that's why this market concept, these market mechanisms are so important right now. Right. And the reason why it's hard to implement this is the coordination failures amongst all different groups really is the challenge. How do we cut through these coordination failures? And I think the biodiversity credit system, the market mechanism, actually is the way to explain this to all different stakeholders and really show transparency of impact so that everyone understands what's being done, right? And I want to make a point here that oceans are chronically underfunded. So if you look at total conservation funding spent around the world, 4% has gone to oceans, and carbon markets only 0.2%. And it's not easy to make a mangrove carbon project. Trust me, we've tried. There's a lot of factors why that is. I'll go into that in a minute. And this is actually, since we are modeling what we're doing over carbon markets, we got to understand what works in carbon and what doesn't. So we're having fun here, right? The good, the bad, the ugly. So the good of a carbon market, and I'm talking voluntary markets at this point, is you have these public methodologies that are science-based, that everyone can see. This is how the projects operate, what data they collect, and how they report impact with transparent results. Innovation is absolutely rewarded in carbon markets. There's a lot of interesting things happening in ocean sort of alkalinity or things like that. And fundamentally, a voluntary carbon market is charitable. Whoever buys a voluntary credit and retires it They get no financial value back. They only get goodwill. That is a charitable transaction at that point. But the market mechanism allows investors to come in and make an ROI, not all the money, but they can make some money in solving this, right? That's the beauty of ecosystem markets. The bad in carbon is they're just too complicated. It's really hard to launch a carbon project. And that stifles innovation because investors aren't willing to take a risk of their money, right? And also, only certain ecosystems work in the way carbon markets are designed. Like ocean ecosystems just don't work. I already showed you the stats on that. And coral reefs literally can't even be covered at all because they're carbon neutral ecosystems, right? And the social benefits are not fundamental in carbon markets. They're there if you know where to look. There's good projects that provide great social benefits. There's ones that don't, right? But it's not fundamental. We want to make that fundamental. But the ugly is really the key point here, is that the storytelling around carbon is terrible. And the reputation is not great because of that. They haven't responded to the criticisms lately. And part of the problem is that nobody actually understands what the credit unit is. Like, what is a ton of CO2 anyways? But the biggest, most ugly thing about all of this whole scheme is that it was designed for literally a 25-year-old vision of how we solve climate change. But now that we've crossed tipping points, it's no longer valid. We've got to speed it up. So here's our example of how we're speeding it up and solving problems, right? So biodiversity blocks. We actually built this Jenga tower at COP16 in Colombia, and this is the story. This is the vision, right? Humans are taking out ecosystems, or destabilizing them. They're taking blocks out, and pretty soon the whole tower will collapse. So what we need to do is actually put blocks back in to stabilize the tower. So which ecosystem block will you put in, right? That's kind of the vision, and that's the symbol of our movement. And movements like ours need symbols. Our goals are to empower community-led projects, focus on marine ecosystems, incorporate the latest science in our methodologies, have transparent outcome reporting by using a blockchain registry, that's a Regen network, and fundamentally engage the public in the impacts that we're creating. So here's our first project. It's on the Merereni, Kenya mangrove restoration project operated by Quebec. We have 300,000 blocks available now at $3 each, and each block plants one tree. It includes monitoring over 10 years and supports the local community to prevent logging and do tree education and things like that. We're projecting a 47% biodiversity uplift, which I'll explain in a moment how that works. You can go to our website right now, and I think we put links in the chat to go to our website and see our methodology. You can buy a block right now and retire it. And by the way, we do not sell the credits. We actually retire them on behalf of our donors. So you will get a retirement certificate if you buy a block from our website. So here's some key principles that we're using in our methodology and our vision. And this is really key. Like, we're not copying how carbon runs credits. We're using the good stuff, but we're making it more efficient and effective. And so I'm going to cover a bunch of these things in just a moment, right? So number one, we're using a stewardship credit model. So this is actually probably the most radical thing we're doing. We are not measuring biodiversity in our credit unit. We're measuring the work done to restore biodiversity. So a tree planted is the work being done, right? Or a square foot of kelp forest restored, or a coral fragment in place on a reef. That's a unit of work, and that's easily understandable. This is the whole point, right? Is that our buyers will know what they're buying. They're buying the unit of work, and they're not buying the outcome. Like, carbon credits are outcome-based credits, and they're expecting an outcome that works. And fundamentally, one of the biggest storytelling failures in carbon in the last few years is that buyers of credits didn't realize there was risk in the outcome they thought they purchased. And when they found out some of the credits actually didn't work, they raised hell, right? And the carbon markets didn't respond to that properly. So we think this is the right way to do it, because also this allows innovation to go faster. Like, outcome credits take years for outcomes to be measured. So if we want to do a biodiversity outcome credit, how many years do you have to wait before you can actually sell the credit? Whereas if you're selling the unit of work, you can pay for that right now, right? And you can invent new ways to restore ecosystems faster and try them out and see what works. And then the buyers themselves know they're sharing the risk. And that's the most fundamental thing, is that the buyers of the credits share the risk here because they're buying the unit of work, they're not buying the outcome. They still expect the outcome, and I'll explain how we do the outcome in a minute, okay? But fundamentally, we have a methodology. It's posted on the Regen registry. Anyone who's looking to start their own biodiversity credit, check out Regen. Their platform is open, transparent, and really the model of how registries should be working in the future, because it's so transparent using blockchain. Yeah, I mentioned before, we really want to highlight the work of local communities who do the work. Like, they're the heroes here. They're the ones who know how to restore and protect their local ecosystems, and we're empowering them to do so for the benefit of all. Now, here's how we measure biodiversity uplift. So the idea is, what's the change in biodiversity from the work being done? So imagine a dead reef on the left and a pristine reef on the right, and that sets the biodiversity spectrum. And then you have monitoring sites and reference sites, and you can basically show the change over time as you're working to restore biodiversity in a certain area. And the way you measure it is you start with the metrics. So there's basically three types of metrics in ecology for biodiversity. There's structure, that's the habitat, form, and species. You can't have a forest without trees. You can't have a reef without coral, right? So you have to have those key ecosystem species. And then within that, you have all the other critters, flora and fauna that live within the habitat. And then you have the function. Is the ecosystem actually sequestering carbon, producing clean air, fresh water, food for the local communities, et cetera, right? Those are the metrics. So here's how we did it in Kenya, is we chose a handful of metrics in each of those categories. And then we have our partner measuring them as we're going on. We measured baselines last year, and now we're actually planting the trees this year. We'll be doing the first year monitoring at the end of 2025. And you basically average them out, and we're projecting a 47% uplift at the end of 10 years of this project. Right now, for those on the call who are thinking about doing their own biodiversity credit project, the key thing is to understand what are the right baskets of metrics, right? And we're happy to help you figure that out if you'd like to reach out to us. It's this is the key. You've got to choose metrics that are measurable, that are achievable, that are not impossible to measure, right? But that actually reflect the changes in the biodiversity of ecosystem. And it's not that hard to do, but you really have to think about this. This is key to think about this, right? Now, one of the things that we're most excited about in terms of what we're accomplishing is empowering a local community to uplift their scientific capability. Like, they know intuitively how to observe their ecosystem and the health of it, but now they're getting the scientific tools to actually quantify what they already know. And they've been stoked on how to do this, like, counting crabs or measuring snails or soil carbon and so on, right? I think that's kind of the goal here, is like, we're bringing science into local communities all around the world in this framework. And that's a really exciting result. And we can easily combine various data types in a methodology. In fact, we're about to add a new bioacoustic monitoring system into this Kenya project, which is again, the flexibility of our approach is you can quickly launch new projects and quickly add new data types into it and still have data through the stewardship credit. And the other thing we're doing, which I won't get into a lot of detail now, but we're building a database online where people can go in and see the dashboard of their impact and interact with it, interact with the photos and videos and so on. Because I think at the end of the day, buyers want to know the impact was there and they want to feel good about their purchase. And quite often they don't get much feedback when they buy a credit. But with us, they'll get the photos, the videos, the data, the reports, and so on. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It was great to have that real, tangible outcomes. It gives a little bit of that tactile feel to the subject as well. So we have been, let me just do a share screen here. We've been learning about the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, models and research taking place to create that sort of scalable structure for biodiversity credits. We've heard about the market and the importance of developing like a tradable value for these biodiversity credits. And then Kevin's just been sharing on the ground actual tangible projects that are taking place. And I know a lot of the questions coming through are looking at that, like how would you implement a marine biodiversity market at the state or province level, sort of that sort of tangible and actual piece. So what I wanted to do is ask our speakers if a community or local jurisdiction wants to set up a biodiversity credit, what do you recommend that they do to start designing and establishing it? What actions and best practices do you recommend? And I was hearing, Kevin, you were saying sort of work out what the buckets are, work out the different pieces that would make up the credit at the end there. So what actions and best practices do you recommend for a local community group or local jurisdiction who are wanting to set up a biodiversity credit? And I open that up to all the speakers. Raise your hand if you'd like to go first, or just speak up. That's okay too.
Okay, I'll kick off on that. I mean, first, you've got to have a viable project in terms of an intervention that is likely to lead to a significant uplift. You might be closing an area of reef, you might be restoring an area of mangrove or whatever. Once you've got that as a viable project, and remember, it's got to be a reasonable scale as well, because you're going to have it independently verified. And that's the crucial bit. You can't sort of calculate a credit and then give it out yourself, because not a lot of people are going to value that. It needs to be independently validated. And what I would always do is, before you start planning your monitoring that you're going to do for that, is go to that verification body, whether it's Plan Vivo, whether it's BERA, whether it's Biodiversity Futures Initiative, and say to them, this is what I'm planning to do. These are the metrics I'm going to use. These are my methods, etc., and get them to agree that in advance of you actually spending any time and effort gathering all of those data. Because once you've got that, once you've got approval that your methodology and your monitoring and your intervention is acceptable to an independent body, then you've got a realistic chance of raising some funding or attracting a philanthropist. And what Kevin's doing is fantastic, because he's basically using the philanthropic market. People say, yeah, I want to do some good. And then what they end up doing is getting some units of biodiversity gain back again. Now, Kevin doesn't allow you, you're only talking about sort of primary markets. We think the secondary market's important as well, so that they can be traded and prices can be established. Because if you don't do that, then the only people who will be able to buy those credits are people who can fund an entire project or part of a project. So if we can get them trading, it'll be so much better. Sorry, that was a long rambling answer to your question, but basically just sit and think about it first. Drop me an email, drop Kevin an email, and any of us. And you know, I'm sure we're all happy to help to get you started.
Thank you, Tim. And Kevin, would you like to add to that?
I mean, Tim covered most of it, but I'll just reiterate, the key thing is, what is the methodology you're going to use? You got to think about that. You can read ours, for example, you can, how we're doing it. There's others like Plan Vivo and, you know, that Tim's mentioned, or Wallacea Trust. You also need a registry, right? You got to figure out where your credits will actually be posted so people can track them when they've been produced and retired. And Regen is the one that we're using. There's others that are out there too, and you've got to figure out like which one makes the most sense for you. And I mean, I would say reach out to Regen if you're really curious and talk to them about your idea. That's kind of what they're meant to do. They're meant to help new projects launch quickly and build a framework around it.
Thank you both. That's really helpful. And I see Calvin George, you've raised your hand if you'd like to unmute yourself and share your question for our speakers.
Hi, my name is Calvin George. I work for the University of Alaska. I also have involvement with the Alaska Mariculture Alliance and going to be representing one of the Southwest tribes. I am a Tlingit from the Southeast tribe. And my question would be in regards to involvement with the Alaska industries. I've been piecing together some notes here, and it's based off from the topic of marine conservation. I liked the tree planting credits initiative. And would it be possible to work with the Alaska mariculture industry in collaboration with BCA to develop a conservation for Alaska fisheries, as there's a weaning, like seriously scale tipping decline in Alaska salmon populations?
So I think that would be a good question for Josh. Does that seem like a good fit for you, Josh?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to tackle that. And apologies, I'm going to keep my camera off. I'm having a little bit of internet connectivity issues here with the current storm here in California. So I think basically the role that BCA could play in something like that would be just to, you know, have the market guidance that we have available would help inform that type of approach. BCA doesn't work at the level of individual project schemes or crediting methodologies or approaches. So, but we'd be happy to provide, anytime somebody does have questions around developing an approach on biodiversity credits, we're happy to serve as sort of an information resource and knowledge network to connect you with possible other partners or examples, point to sources of guidance and methodologies, things like that. So, always happy to work with people, and certainly appreciate the interest in developing that effort, Calvin, in my home state of Alaska as well. So, I'd love to discuss further. But yeah, generally speaking, BCA doesn't work at that really individual project level, but has a broader approach to providing guidance and principles for the market.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank
Other
you.
speakers, do you want to add to that? And fine, I think Josh covered it. And what I would do is I would like to encourage our speakers, if you, I know some of you have put links and whatnot to connect with you in the chat. If you feel like you'd like to add to the chat a way to connect with you for further discussion, because we do have a lot of questions coming in. If people want to follow up with you, if you're able to do that, please feel free to share in the chat those options. I do see, so Cody Harris, are you still online with us here? I see several questions that have popped up in the Q&A from you. And one of them that popped out for me, and you're welcome to, if you want to raise your hand and ask yourself, or I'll ask on your behalf. It looks like you're located down in San Diego. Are there template transactions that could be used to make a local transaction easier or cheaper? For instance, something that a local conservation organization could take to a particular corporate buyer, such as SeaWorld here in San Diego. I wonder if our speakers have thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's kind of the point of what a biodiversity credit is meant to do. But if it's a small local transaction, like it's a question, do you need the credit model in the first place? To issue a credit, you have to have a methodology that's science-based, that's documented and written. Ours is like 60 pages, right? And then the project has to have its companion project description document, the PD doc, which is again, is like how that project operates under the methodology. Then you got to collect baseline data ahead of time, and then have a monitoring plan over however long the project operates, and issue reports on those monitors. That has higher value in a market that values proof of impact. But if it's a small scale project with a small funder, do you need that complexity? That's the question. So I don't know. Something you have to answer for yourself.
And do you all make those documents public by chance if that level of complexity was necessary or valuable to use as sort of a template and to take to an organization to see if to even start the conversation?
Well, yes. So all methodologies have to be public. That's the whole point. So they're either posted on the registry or on the project developer's website and so on. Like they're posted on ours. You can go under VGen and find it as well. I think we posted them in the chat, links to those in the chat. And it's, it's a higher level complexity for a higher value operation. But it's philanthropic for voluntary, it's fundamentally philanthropic. So maybe the credit model is too complicated for a philanthropic transaction and just do it the old school way, right? That's the question.
And what would the old school way be?
Get a grant, operate a project,
Yeah.
apply for a grant and get the money and run it and report on it, right? One of the things I think we can do though is that every granting organization has a different way of like application, a different way of reporting, and that complexity itself is holding back sort of scale, right? It only can scale so far. A credit market, because it's standardized and transparent and open, can scale much faster once it gets rolling. But we're so new in biodiversity credits right now, like such early stage, that there is no rolling market yet. We're trying to create that, like literally as we speak. We're trying to create more innovative models. Like we've got our model that we think can be more flexible and faster, and we're hoping that we can scale it up too. But we haven't got a lot of buyers yet either. We're talking to buyers, but we haven't had that super large sale yet that was like, yes, this is the first major step. Although we're close on a few conversations, so we'll see.
Great. And I wanted to ask also, how can we engage the sort of corporate interest side of things to really build that market and to fuel that market? So at this time, it seems that we've got the philanthropic side is sort of driving it at this point. How do we get into that corporate, building in that interest from that corporate interest side of things so that you can create a, more of a, I guess, sustainable market that we could build out. So I wondered if you had some comments on that.
I'll go quick, and I'd love to hear Josh's thoughts on it too, but yeah, one of our things is having the content media, because that's always a value when a corporation is donating. I'm talking about the excitement of a credit model being able to scale, including in allowing tech to come in, like monitoring tech or whatever. We're finding that's a really attractive component. We just announced a partnership with Samsung to use their phones to monitor coral reef restoration, for example. And then the third one would be making biodiversity credits fit existing frameworks like science-based targets or nature positive commitments. That's a really exciting way, but figuring out the translation layer between that is work that we're doing now.
Thank you, Kevin. And I see Tim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the market we work in all the time now. We're looking for commercial investors rather than philanthropists. The problem at the moment with corporates is there's no business case really that's been made in the companies for them to actually spend money directly on it. So what you're seeing is a few corporates are saying, look, we want to do something about this. We will go beyond our value chain and we will help a project. We'll put some philanthropic funding into something like a 30 by 30 project, for example. If you're within that network, fantastic. That will help you get some potential funding. The thing that's really driving the market at the moment is the reporting requirements, because in Europe now, corporates are having to report on their nature impacts. If you have to report, you have to measure. Once you measure, you realize, whoops, we're not doing too well here. We ought to be doing something positive about it. And that's what's driving it at the moment, just reporting requirements. So I think without proof of price, you're never going to get commercial investment. You're stuck in the short term on philanthropic type investments from corporates.
Thank you, Tim. That's great. Yes, go ahead, JC.
Sorry, I couldn't find the button quickly enough.
That's
I
okay.
think a key requirement and a reason why we see demand for carbon credits is that firms that emit carbon are required to engage in the market by passing off regulation. Currently, a firm that degrades the environment is not required to engage in the market because we have not established a cap, and therefore there's no way to incentivize them to engage in such a market. And I think it's an interesting case in that for the carbon markets, regulation came first, the market followed, and then we realized, oh, well, we can also sell the credits for the carbon that's stored in the mangroves or the seagrass or whatnot to the market that already existed. Whereas here, we are already engaging in the conservation of the marine environment and producing the biodiversity credits, but nobody is required to buy those credits. And that is a key thing. I think passing new regulation that requires the degraders of the environment to engage in such markets would be a good first step towards incentivizing that.
Great. Josh.
The thing that's stopping that happening, Juan Carlos, is because in carbon, you've got a standard called past 2060, which is how you work out your scope 1, scope 2, etc. There's no equivalent in biodiversity, and biodiversity footprinting is so much more difficult to do. And until that gets sorted, that's going to slow down the compliance element.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, go ahead, Josh. Thank you,
Yeah,
Tim.
no, I could just jump in for a second there. I think, the question around demand and where is demand going to come from and how is it going to scale is, one that we get often. And I think it's still early days to say exactly, how that's going to go. But we do see a lot of progress in, corporations increasing their understanding of their relationship with nature and their dependencies on nature. And, sort of we see sort of a journey from, companies engaging through the TNFD guidance and nature-related financial disclosures, understanding their impacts and dependencies, developing science-based targets for nature, and developing their corporate nature strategies. And then they get to that point and they say, okay, well, what do we do now? How do we implement our corporate nature strategy? And we expect that biodiversity credits will play some role in that, not be the full solution or answer. But, I think TNFD really only got going, in a practical sense in the last year or two. So there's still a pathway and a runway for companies to start further developing their understanding around how they engage. And it's going to take some time. I think there's no short-term, gas, that we can pour on that fuel we can pour on that fire necessarily, but we do have to get the market in place with the different pieces of governance, different guidelines, the different pieces that provide confidence and transparency in the market, so that when companies do want to engage, that they have confidence that they can do so with integrity, and that they're engaging in a way that doesn't put them in some sort of headline risk, or worse, is just like not actually doing anything productive in terms of biodiversity or for people. So companies really want to understand and know that if they're going to purchase a biodiversity credit, that it has some real benefit. So getting those pieces in place is what we're working on. It's going to take some time.
Thank you so much. And I think we are almost at time. We have one more question. I see, Talivardi, you have your hand raised. If you would like to ask our last question of the session, that would be fantastic. Go for it.
Great, thanks so much, Tali Vardy from the Coral Restoration Consortium. I have two questions, and they're probably too big to squeeze in the last few seconds. But one is, our organization helps people who are doing reef restoration around the world, and so I was wondering how those groups can access anyone who's interested in buying the service that they're already providing, which is restoring their local reefs. There's 800 projects around the world right now, and cash is always the limiting factor there. That's one question. And the other one is, we're just getting organized. We have a map of all the coral restoration projects happening in the world, but we're just starting to get organized for actually tracking like the size and the success of coral reef restoration around the world. And it's occurring to me now that meshing the way we do that with some sort of biodiversity credit metrics would be wise, but it seems like currently that's being done project by project, and it depends if it's Caribbean or Pacific. And I don't know, just to kind of wanted to raise that in case anyone has any thoughts on the matter.
We're actively developing coral reef biodiversity credit methodologies right now and looking at projects that we're going to implement them on. We should talk and see if there's some collaboration. I mean, it's really about right now, like everyone on this call, like I said, we're ecopreneurs, right? We want to collaborate with everyone and figure out what's going to work for the future, right? We're not copying the past, we're creating the future of how our economic systems value nature. And we just got to try stuff and see what sticks. A market will reward what really works. Like that's the point of market mechanism, reward what works. And by the way, nature is a market, like evolution, survival of the fittest species, that's also a market in a way. So there's a lot of parallels between what we're doing here.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kevin. And we're going to close right there. I do want to just take a moment to thank our speakers today. Really appreciate your time, and our audience for such amazing questions. If our speakers do see things that are in the Q&A and they want to take a moment to answer any of those, I'm sure our audience would greatly appreciate that. And as I mentioned, there will be a recording of the session, and we'll be sharing that as well. We have just a couple. Whoops, I'm so sorry. I skipped really quickly there. We have a poll that we would like to just launch really quickly for our audience, just to capture a little bit of information from all of you on the experience you had and topics that you're interested in learning about. If you could just take a moment before we close here. And Josh, I see you have your hand up. Is that intentional?
Yeah, it is. Just real quick, Sadie, if
Yeah.
even if we don't have time to answer all the Q&As right now, I think hopefully you guys are capturing those in the record of the meeting, and maybe the panelists could provide a quick written answer to those questions after the meeting, that we could be disseminated with the meeting summary or something like that.
we would greatly appreciate that. And we will absolutely work with our team to do that. That would be great. Really appreciate that extra touch there. So as we're closing, feel free to continue with the poll. And we just want to share a couple slides here on our coastal funding database. And Lilia, if you'd like to just give us a quick run through, this is a source of funding. So when you're looking for that seed funding, that philanthropic push to get all this work going, this is an area, if you're not signed up for already, that you might find resources. So I'll ask Lilia to give us a quick rundown.
Yeah, sure. It'll be extra quick as I know we're over time, but Coastal Quest maintains a coastal funding database. As the slide kind of hints, all of these opportunities will support coastal resilience programs and projects that sort of benefit people, nature, and climate. About 5 new opportunities are added each week. That's give or take, depending on what's coming out, but I'll be updating it weekly, and we send out emails every other week. So we do have you can sign up for our mailing list. That will be at the top of the coastal funding database page, the link to which I dropped in the chat. That's my very brief information.
Thank you. And I didn't mean to rush you at the end there. I just was getting to next steps here. As I've mentioned, the session has been recorded and will be shared. Reach out to us with questions, please. We want to hear from you, and be on the lookout for future resources and webinars. There's a couple QR codes here for staying in touch with us on social media, which is a space where we do announce a lot of our upcoming events. You can also reach out to us at Coastal NBS. That's our general Coastal Nature-Based Solutions email address, or you can see my email contact information there as well as Lilia's. Great. And if you've answered the poll, we greatly appreciate you participating with us today. Thank you so much for being such an engaged audience. It was fantastic to hear all the questions, and we'll be following up. And that closes our session for today. Thank you so much. If our speakers will stay on just for a moment, but the rest of you, you're welcome to go about your day. Thank you. And we'll close that poll.